Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into something really crucial. It's the current state of India's startup ecosystem.
Yeah, it's a hot topic. Lots happening.
Definitely. We've got some great material, especially this analysis, projection of India's growth.pdf. It really looks closely at funding policy.
And that whole debate around deep tech versus, the service startups.
Exactly. And for everyone listening who wants the core insights fast, well, that's our mission today. We're pulling out the key stuff on where India's tech innovation is right now and maybe where it's heading. Okay, so let's get into it.
Right. I think a good starting point is just the sheer scale of funding, or maybe the lack of it, comparatively speaking.
Okay.
If you look at 2014 to 2024, India brought in about $160 billion in startup funding.
Sounds like a lot on its own.
It does. But then you put it next to China, $845 billion.
Whoa.
And the U.S., $2.32 trillion.
Trillion. Okay, that really puts the $160 billion in perspective. A completely different league.
It is a huge difference in the available capital right from the start. And that obviously impacts what kind of projects can even get off the ground.
Absolutely. A very different playing field. But we should also say, despite that gap, the Indian ecosystem has grown significantly, hasn't it? Creating something like $600 billion in value.
Oh, absolutely. That's undeniable. The growth has been impressive. Lots of value created, speaks volumes about the talent and drive there.
Yeah.
Especially in the few years, post-pandemic maybe. But here's where the story gets a bit concerning.
Okay.
The annual funding flow, it's contracted. A lot.
How much were we talking?
Well, it peaked around, say, $42 billion annually. Recently, it's more like $10 to $12 billion.
Ouch. That's a massive drop. The report compares it to a company's revenue falling, 35%?
Exactly. Imagine that kind of hit. That's the sort of pressure the whole ecosystem is feeling.
And that must change the outlook, right?
Ah.
I remember projections were hitting $1 trillion by 2025.
They were. But that's been revised down now. Significantly. Also by about 35%, actually. So the new estimate is more like $650 to $700 billion.
Still huge, but definitely a tempering of expectations.
For sure. And this funding squeeze, it's not hitting everyone equally.
Right.
Deep tech startups, the ones working on really fundamental science or engineering breakthroughs, they often need more time, more R&D.
They need that patient capital you hear about.
Precisely. Investment that can wait longer for returns. And that's proving especially hard to come by now. The report mentions over 4,500 deep tech startups are really struggling for that kind of funding.
Which leads us straight into that big debate, doesn't it? The focus on quick commerce, delivery services versus pushing into deep tech.
Yeah, you hear concerns, sometimes even from government circles, about whether India's maybe too focused on the service side.
But there's a counter-argument, too, right? That this is just a natural evolution.
There is. Some industry veterans point to China's path. They started heavily with e-commerce, logistics, building that foundation.
And then moved into EVs, semis, the really complex stuff.
Exactly. It's a potential pathway. Build the infrastructure, the talent pool, the market understanding first.
And it's not like these service startups are using basic tech either. Some of the logistics, the AI, the cloud computing involved, it's incredibly sophisticated.
Absolutely. Managing millions of transactions, complex delivery networks. That takes serious tech chops. That's real innovation, too.
Definitely.
But, the potential in India's deep tech, biotech, genomics, chip design, India's actually got a strong base in chip design already.
Right.
But moving from design to actual manufacturing, getting products to market, that takes massive capital and supportive policies.
Like the semiconductor policy from a couple years back.
Yeah, that's a step, but probably just the beginning of what's needed for that kind of industrial shift.
And we can't ignore the jobs created by the service sector either. The report says about 1 million jobs, often gig economy work, flexible.
Reasonably paid, too, in many cases. So yeah, it's created huge employment. The report really argues for balance. Recognize the value of the service startups, the jobs, the tech they use.
But also actively fix the gaps holding back deep tech, funding, policy.
Exactly. It's not an either. It needs to be a both and.
Okay, let's pivot a bit then. Let's talk policy. Because the report draws some pretty sharp contrasts with China's approach.
Yeah, the difference in government investment is striking.
How so?
Look at China's figures. Estimated $150 billion into AI over 5-7 years. Maybe $50-60 billion into EV development over the last decade.
Wow. That's serious strategic money. And it paid off, right? They're leading in EV adoption globally now.
They are. That kind of focused, long-term government backing makes a huge difference.
India's approach. There have been announcements that 10,000 crore AI fund a year or two ago, the Frontier Tech Fund.
Right, there have been announcements. But the report suggests the implementation, the actual impact. It's often unclear. It hasn't seemed to materialize at the same scale or with the same clarity yet.
And comparing investment as a chunk of the economy, like GDP percentage.
Big difference there, too. China investing around 40% of GDP, India much lower. It just shows a different set of national priorities, or at least resource allocation.
And it goes back to that sequence idea. China built consumer internet, then poured state money into deep tech.
Yeah, that patient government capital was key for their transition. India had a similar start with consumer services.
But the big, sustained push into deep tech funding hasn't quite followed in the same way.
Doesn't seem like it, not on that scale. The report highlights this imbalance. It mentions 9 lakh crore on social welfare subsidies.
Which is obviously important.
Of course. But compared to maybe just 1,000 to 3,000 crores specifically for innovation funding, it's a tiny fraction. Raises questions about balancing present needs and future competitiveness.
And it's not just the money figure itself, is it? The report also talks about coordination, or lack thereof.
Right. A lack of really joined-up innovation policy between the national and state levels. It creates a fragmented system. Complex regulations, sometimes confusing for startups.
Unlike China's more centralized approach.
Yeah, China's is much more top-down, coordinated. In India, startups can spend a lot of time just navigating different rules, different states. That adds friction.
And then there are specific regulatory hurdles,
I feel
like that angel tax issue.
The angel tax. That was a major headache for years, nearly a decade. Taxing early investments as income. It directly hit the earliest stage funding despite tons of industry feedback.
Shows how even well-meaning policy can go wrong in execution, doesn't it?
It really does. And that leads into another big constraint, the report flags. Domestic funding sources.
What's the issue there?
It's the sheer amount of potential capital within India that's just not really participating in venture capital or startups.
Like what kind of capital?
Think about Indian insurance companies. Huge asset pools, maybe 80 lakh crore. The pension industry, another 25, 30 lakh crore. Together, that's around 100 lakh crore.
Okay, that's enormous.
It is. But because of regulatory restrictions, they invest almost nothing in venture capital. It's basically off limits for them.
Wow. That's a massive pool just sitting on the sidelines. And universities, too.
Same story. University endowments, which are crucial innovation funders elsewhere, especially the U.S., they face barriers here. They can't easily allocate even, say, 5% to startups.
So the money exists domestically, but the rules prevent it from flowing into innovation.
Largely, yes. And then there's the perception of the RBI's stance. Industry leaders quoted in the report use pretty strong words: oppressive, tyrannical, focused on control.
That sounds like it creates a lot of friction.
It does, for legitimate transactions, too.
Yeah.
Slows things down, adds costs. There are even concerns mentioned about potential hits to UPI from things like GST and higher transaction costs.
So it feels like the regulatory environment itself can sometimes be an obstacle.
In some areas, yes. And it's not just funding, bureaucracy in general.
How so?
Just administrative stuff. Getting responses from regulators, needing expensive consultants just to figure out processes. It all adds burden.
Especially for early-stage startups, right? They don't have big compliance teams.
Exactly. Deep tech startups, too, operating on tight budgets. The report notes the contrast with how smoothly things often work for public markets. It's much harder for private markets for startups.
It sounds like maybe that initial startup India energy got bogged down in some of these implementation issues.
That's a key point in the report. Good intentions, strong announcements. But then inconsistencies, bureaucratic hurdles, kind of diluted the impact over time. It's a recurring theme, unfortunately.
Okay, so acknowledging all these challenges, funding gaps, policy issues, red tape, what does the report suggest as potential solutions? Where do we go from here?
Well, a big one is sustained government investment in deep tech. Not just one-off announcements, but a real commitment.
How much are they suggesting?
The report recommends something like 10,000 to 20,000 crore annually for the next 5 years, specifically for deep tech.
Annually. Okay, that's a significant step up.
It is, but framed as still modest within the overall government budget. And crucially, using a fund-of-funds approach.
Meaning the government puts money into private venture funds who then invest.
Exactly. Leverage their expertise, potentially better deployment, more accountability.
And just having the money isn't enough, right? Implementation matters.
Hugely important. The report points to examples where public-private collaboration is working better now, ISRO, and interestingly, the Defense Ministry.
The Defense Ministry, how so?
They've apparently made real progress in engaging with startups, bringing them into defense tech development. It shows these models can work within the government system.
Okay, so learn from what's working internally. What else?
Unlocking that domestic capital we talked about, that 100 lakh crore.
The insurance and pension funds.
Yes. Regulatory reform to let them put just a small slice, maybe 5 or 10%, into alternative investments, including startups. That alone could be transformative.
Reducing reliance on foreign funding.
Massively. Right now, something like 85% of startup funding is foreign. Tapping domestic pools would change that equation significantly.
Makes sense. Anything else on the regulatory front?
Simplify rules around capital flows, both money coming in and money going out, like when investors exit. Stabilize the rules for alternative investment funds, the AIFs, with proper industry consultation. Avoid sudden changes.
Stop the uncertainty.
Right. And finally, invest in the underlying R&D infrastructure. Encourage collaboration, universities, labs, corporates, startups, talking to each other, working together.
Because overall, R&D spending is still relatively low.
It is. That's a fundamental piece that needs strengthening through incentives and partnerships.
Okay, so putting this all together,
Sure.
what's the final verdict? The current status, the outlook?
While the report acknowledges the wins, $600 billion in value, India is a global tech destination. That's real.
Yeah.
But the gap with the global innovation leaders is widening because of the investment differences, the regulatory friction, the policy inconsistencies we've discussed.
And that revised projection reflects this. $650, $700 billion by end of 2025, not the trillion.
Exactly. It shows the impact of these constraints. It falls short of the earlier ambition and, maybe increases vulnerability.
So the urgency is real. Policy changes needed, focused on capital, regulation, and that strategic deep tech investment.
Absolutely. And the report is quite blunt about some aspirations, like India overtaking China technologically by 2030.
Yeah, you hear that sometimes.
The report basically says, look at the current growth rates, the investment patterns. The simple math doesn't support that. It's not realistic right now.
So what's a more realistic goal?
Focus on becoming a true global leader in areas where India already has strength. Software development, definitely. Chip design, digital services, build dominance there.
Play to your strengths. Be pragmatic.
Exactly. Acknowledge the limitations, understand the structural problems, and then systematically tackle them with coordinated policies. Less rhetoric, more focused action.
That seems to be the core message. It's about clear-eyed assessment and commitment to fixing the underlying issues.
Precisely. That's the path forward according to this analysis.
Okay, so for everyone listening, let's quickly recap. India's startup scene. Dynamic, valuable, yes, but facing real headwinds. Funding, especially for deep tech, is tight. Policy differences with players like China are significant. Domestic capital is largely locked out by regulations, and bureaucracy adds friction.
Right. Service startups have done great things, created jobs, but a strategic shift with serious sustained investment in deep tech, plus major regulatory reforms, that's what seems essential now to unlock the next level of innovation.
And those earlier growth forecasts, they've been scaled back. It highlights the need to act now, address these systemic problems, or risk falling further behind the global tech leaders.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. Given India's incredible talent pool and the successes we have seen, if you could make just one policy change, what do you think would have the biggest positive impact on boosting deep tech innovation in India? What are the really bold steps needed now to bridge that gap with the frontrunners?